Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's event. Of course, the topic tonight is video games in Civil War history. My name is Paul Quigley. I'm director of the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies at Virginia Tech, which is sponsoring tonight's event. And the center's mission is very straightforward. We're interested in educating as many people as we possibly can about Civil War era history. So we offer lots of events for public audiences, online and in person. We do academic conferences and seminars, K through 12 outreach, and we also support our students here at Virginia Tech with things like scholarships and funded internships. We depend almost exclusively, actually, upon generous donations, past, present, and future. So I want to express my immense gratitude to all of our donors and supporters who make possible things like this evening's event. If you want to know more about what we're up to, you can take a look at our website, civilwar.vt.edu, hopefully nice and easy to remember. Or, of course, you can find us on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube as well. Over the next few months, we've got several exciting things coming up. We recently opened up registration for our annual Civil War weekend, and that takes place in March each year. It's the end of March. I'm going to paste into the chat a link to information about the Civil War weekend. Feel free to check that out and, of course, sign up if you're interested. We also have, even before the Civil War weekend, we've got a free webinar coming up in February 19th, with author Shay Smith Cox, and she's going to be speaking on the topic of uniforms, badges, and flags of the Civil War. So that's going to be another great conversation, I know. Tonight, I'm really pleased to introduce not just one speaker, which is typical for us, but 4 speakers. And we were actually supposed to have 5, you may have noticed on the webinar registration, but unfortunately, Nick Sacco isn't able to join us. We still have 4 great presenters, and they are all editors or contributors to this brand new book, Playing at War, Identity and Memory in Civil War Video Games. So first, we're going to hear from the 2 co-editors of the book, Patrick Lewis and James Hill Welborn III. Lewis, I'll start with him, is the Director of Collections and Research at the Filson Historical Society in Louisville, Kentucky. In January, he's actually going to become the president and CEO of the Filson. So many congratulations to you, Dr. Lewis, for that. Lewis is also author of a book entitled For Slavery and Union, Benjamin Buckner and Kentucky Loyalties in the Civil War. The other co-editor is James Hill Welborn III. He's Associate Professor of History at Georgia College and State University in Milledgeville, Georgia. He's the author of a really fine book that I recommend to you all, Dueling Cultures, Damnable Legacies, Southern Violence, and White Supremacy in the Civil War Era. Following the 2 co-editors, we're going to hear from 2 scholars who contributed individual essays to the volume. First, we'll hear from Kathleen Thompson, who's the curator of the William A. Neal Museum of the Health Sciences at West Virginia University. She earned both her PhD and MA in history at WVU, and she's previously worked for Falling Water and for the National Park Service. And then last but not least, we'll hear from Jonathan S. Jones, who's an assistant professor in the history department at James Madison University, as well as a previous guest on one of our earlier webinars, I think in 2021, which is still available on YouTube, by the way, like many of the others. And Jones's first book is forthcoming from UNC Press with the title Opium Slavery, Civil War Veterans, and Opiate Addiction. So we're going to start with some fairly brief presentations by each of the panelists, and then we're going to have plenty of time for discussion with the audience. And the way we do that in these webinars is to invite you, the audience, to type in your questions at any time into the Q&A box. So you won't be able to turn on the camera or microphone. It will all come through that Q&A box. So we will get to as many of your questions as we possibly can, and then we'll wrap things up by about 8:15 p.m. Eastern Time. That's all from me for now. I want to thank everyone in the audience for joining us, and especially thanks to the panelists for being here and sharing their expertise. So over to you, Patrick and Trae.
Thanks, Paul. Really appreciate the invitation and the introduction. Um, I think Trae and I are going to try to be pretty quick and give a general introduction and let our authors kind of speak for themselves. This has been a lot of fun to do as a book, and it's been a project that simultaneously, and I guess this is something that kind of works for all of us in these past few years. Seems like it took a long time and also no time at all, and I don't know what that means. Trae tells the story really well of how this book came to be, and so I'm going to hand it off to him.
Yeah, I do that because it was such a fortuitous sort of convergence of events. But so this project really began at the SCWH Watson Brown dinner in Louisville at the Southern Historical Association annual meeting in 2019. And so we're sitting around with Matt Stanley and Matt Holbert and several other folks at the table, and we're discussing the mats, as I call them. They had a series with LSU Press that was kind of in the hopper at that point and not yet public. But so it was supposed to be on martial identity and popular culture and American history. And so we got to talking, a table full of 30 somethings, got to talking about our first encounters with the Civil War and Civil War memory and pop culture. And all of us very quickly got to video games as part of that early encounter. And so we started rattling off all the games that we played in our youth and said, it would be great is if we, pulled all this together and put it in this series. So that was kind of where it began. We spent the rest of our time at the conference in Louisville kind of canvassing people for whether they had any experience with video games and asking if they might be interested in contributing an essay. And then that next January or February, we can't really remember exactly when, of 2020, we put out the public call, and then the whole world shut down by March. And so it actually ended up being quite fortuitous in the sense that nobody could go to archives and do research. So we pretty much had anyone who ever had any experience with video games available. And so we got a lot of submissions, really great submissions, and worked through those and ended up getting some great contributors to make up the volume.
Yeah, and it was a very different experience of writing a book than I had. I figured that I'm a journal editor, so I kind of was used to that editorial process. But also, we adapted quite a bit to the Zoom realities, and here we are doing a Zoom webinar still, because I think we've all kind of kept the good things that we took out of that time. But I remember one, playing games, sitting on my couch, with my laptop there and writing chapters and getting, chapters from the authors and sitting, sometimes out on my deck, sometimes in my basement, editing those. We did, really things that we would not have done otherwise. We did some Zoom hangouts with all the authors, or as many of them as could get together, and just kind of socialize and chat. And so I think about that when I look at the table of contents. I think back to those times and kind of thinking through some good memories that we took out of that. Also, this was a game or a book that I think for Trae and I especially kind of kept creeping up into the present, especially with some of those later chapters. Thinking about Dan Farrell's chapter on this game called War of Rights. I mean, the internet conversation is never stopping, and with each round of revisions that we would do, we would creep a little bit closer to the line and closer to the line of the present, including even in our introduction, we kind of snuck in one last game that we didn't have time to put a whole chapter on, but it was kind of this title that seemed to check all the boxes. If the historians had gotten everything they wanted in a Civil War video game, this one might have done it. The question is, does anybody want to play it? And we kind of play with that a little bit in our introduction, and Kathleen does a really great job in her chapter. So I'm not going to spoil this too much about, kind of balancing entertainment and authenticity and things like that. Um, but I think the thing that I'm kind of most proud of from the volume overall is, hopefully injecting a little bit of humility into us as historians, to not dismiss this medium as a valid form of historical interpretation and expression, as a kind of an art and creative form, um, and to recognize a little bit about how, we ourselves, though we don't like to think about it, are, flawed human beings who are working from an incomplete archival record, making assumptions and drawing some leaps that might not be supported by documentation there. And it's easy to tag video games as kind of fantasy and deviating from reality, but a lot of, especially as our authors would dive into and have interactions with some of these game developers and understand that research process, you understand them to sit on a sort of interpretive continuum along with the work that we do.
Yeah, and I think it really kind of charts a course, definitely not a definitive sort of conclusive summative, more of a entry point for further inquiry, but it charts a course for engaging with these spaces, these digital spaces, and this type of medium in some war memory studies moving forward. Because, like Patrick said, it's going to continue to evolve. New games will emerge, new technologies will emerge that will even more complexity and even more global interaction and all of the things that are typical of the digital age, are going to continue to shape game culture, but and games themselves, but also sort of the Civil War memory that's attached to any game that engages historical themes, and I think especially Civil War games, because the Civil War remains sort of a popular conflict and part of American history.
Yeah, and so thinking, would really want most of the conversation to come from the audience and us not to dictate, but just throwing up some ideas that Trae just raised, the kind of the global investment in the Civil War and interest in the Civil War, and the international sort of design process that happens around these games, and what influences and strains does that kind of introduce into the product that we see. I think also, very much this idea of emotional investment of the player, right? You're not just passively consuming the artistic product. You're not sitting in a movie theater. You're playing. It's you, right? Like, you have agency, and that creates a bond between the player and the topic of the game that I think is worth exploring and thinking about. And that also leads to this desire to get on the internet and talk about it. And methodologically, it is a little bit daunting. If you're doing memory studies, a couple decades ago is pretty easy, right? You watch some movies, you read some books, you go out to some National Park Service sites, and you pretty much got your bases covered. Tracking down anonymous commenters, across different, fora and social media platforms, and trying to sort of discern what a fragmented, digital conversation is sort of coalescing around in terms of some new strains of historical memory. Like, it's going to be wild. But I also think that's kind of where digital spaces have driven a public conversation, right? And a lot of the uncertainty, for example, that pollers or opinion folks had going into the election, you just don't know, because it's so hard to get a grasp on public opinion in this hyper fragmented digital age. So maybe we got a little bit of taste of that uncertainty ourselves.
Yeah, at no point in graduate school did I think a deep dive into a Reddit thread on a particular Civil War game or series of games was going to be part of the research process, but here we are. I think with that, I know there's a question in the chat about sort of what some of the experiential aspects, what some of the game design and characteristics of these games are. But I think it'd be best to kind of turn it over to Kathleen, and because I think she'll probably address a good bit of that and drawn from her chapter, and then we can talk about some other games that are in the volume as we go.
All right. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. I am battling a cold, so I'm so sorry for my voice. But I think I'm the odd man out of probably this entire group of contributors because I did not play video games at all growing up. That was just not part of my childhood or my experience. However, I married into a family that is very into video games, including my husband. So, I'm always very curious about how things are done. Things like the early Assassin's Creed video games that really had a lot of historical accuracy behind them. I thought that was very, very cool. So when I saw the call for proposals, and of course, like they mentioned, it was the beginning of COVID, so we were all stuck. I thought, how cool would it be to dive into how developers see historical accuracy in these games? And so this was a very, very different research process and methodology than I think anything that I'd ever done. And I think very different than most of our historical research because I wasn't going to archives, I wasn't looking at historical documents. Um, Basically, what I did was try to compile a list of as many of the Civil War video games as I could find, going all the way back to some of the early ones, to War of Rights, which I know was mentioned earlier. And I reached out to as many of the developers and creators as I could of those games, asking if they would basically sit down with me for an interview or do a like email interview where I'd send some questions and they would answer back. So my chapter is based largely on some secondary research about ideas of historical accuracy in video gaming and things like that. But really, these conversations that I had with developers of different games. And that was very, very interesting as a historian, because again, it wasn't something that I was used to doing. But it really became clear as I was talking to a lot of these developers that they do strive for a sense of historical accuracy, but that historical accuracy is very different from what a like academic or scholarly historian is going to look at. So in terms of that question about kind of describing some of the video games, I know Jonathan will talk about his chapter, and maybe Trae and Patrick can talk about the games that they looked at in their chapters. But a lot of Civil War video games that you can look at are strategy games of some sort. You start to see some new ones in more modern, like War of Rights is a first kind of like a first person shooter, which is a little bit different. But the majority of the Civil War games are these strategy games, which are largely kind of top down views, where you can move troops on maps and make decisions to guide how a battle is going to go. This is very much kind of birthed from early kind of war gaming strategy games in like the early Cold War period, where you'd have physical maps and you would strategize on them. That translated into kind of these digital hex maps where, again, that top-down view, you could decide to move troops one way or another, choose what actions they would take, kind of a turn-based combat system. So that's kind of the general gist of a lot of video games, and then they kind of take their own flavor from there. What's interesting about talking to these developers was not just looking at how their view of historical accuracy was a little bit different than scholarly historians, but when you look at video games as a type of media, it is very different even than television or movies, where, you know, if you look at like a theatrical play or a movie, there's some artistic license that is taken to make it either fit better or make it more entertaining, but you're still consuming that media. With video games, the power is in the player's hands. They can make choices and make decisions in that game to get to a certain outcome. So while historians, like all of us in our academic lives, usually look at a very holistic sense of historical accuracy, trying to put all these different complex pieces of information that we have about a time period or an event to create as big a picture and as complete a picture of what is happening at that moment, and kind of what leads up to that moment or what comes out of that moment. For video games, really the idea of historical accuracy is creating a starting point that is as historically accurate as possible for a player to then go off from. So while academic historians are going to be looking, especially kind of in more modern scholarship, at the let's say the battlefield, but also the home front, the soldier experience, but also the experience of enslaved peoples or women, or kind of all these sometimes conflicting, but all these pieces of the puzzle to create a picture of what is happening during the Civil War era. For a lot of these developers, they are looking at accuracy as, I'm going to create a place basically in the game where my player can have all of the accurate troop numbers and weapons and artillery trajectories and all those things that are hyper realistic, so that they can then go off and make those decisions. In a video game, it doesn't matter if you get to the historically correct endpoint. You can play a video game of Gettysburg and you can have the Confederates win, depending on the decisions that you make. So it doesn't necessarily have an accurate outcome in the same way that like a scholarly historical piece would. Um, a couple reasons for why that happens based on the conversations I had with developers. One was, of course, that this has to be entertaining. Players want to have some sort of agency in playing the game. So you can't just pigeonhole them into one place to get, let's say, exactly what happens at Gettysburg step by step. Well, that's not really fun because there's no actual playing in that sense. It's not entertaining. On the other hand, if you just give them free rein and there's kind of no boundaries to make it remotely accurate, well, then it also kind of goes off the rails too. So a lot of what I heard from these developers was kind of creating like an axis. How fun can I get it? How realistic can I get it? Where's the sweet spot of something that is going to seem very accurate to my players, but also be fun and allow them to make all these choices and kind of play around with it, see what outcomes they can have. One of the things that was very interesting was I interviewed someone from the John Tiller games. And if you're familiar at all with, especially strategy gaming, the Tiller games are kind of the like creme de la creme of simulation. They are hyper accurate to the point where there's a lot of historical research that goes into setting up those maps. They have like down to the exact troop numbers that are in each company. What kinds of weapons did that company have or not have? So there's a very, very deep well of research that goes into each of those games. But at the end, you can have a very non-historically accurate outcome. Because every choice you make in the game could end up, you know, changing the fate of the battle. But so another one, I think it was War of Rights too. I'm trying to remember. When I talked to them, they were talking about how they had researched the geography of the battlefield to like every little detail of what rocks were where, what trees were where, to try to make sure that it was as immersively accurate to the battles as they could. So it's very interesting that their sense of accuracy was more of a kind of graphic accuracy. Are my players going to recognize these things that will make them feel like this is an accurate scenario, rather than are we going to get to the accurate ending point that actually happened in history? So, overall, it was very fun to kind of play with these ideas of, as an academic, knowing how we do history and how we look at historical, accuracy, seeing how a different kind of medium plays with that accuracy in a very, very different way, but also knowing that that influences my students coming into the classroom, that influences the people coming into the visitor centers at our battlefields, knowing kind of what their sense of accuracy might be based on that media, versus what a scholarly historian might consider as accuracy, is very, very interesting. Kind of allows us to meet more of the public where they are, um, so that there's more conversation about kind of, okay, you now know every little bit of the battlefield. Let's branch off from that. Let's see what else we can get out of understanding this history together. Um, so that's kind of an overview of what I did. I am certainly happy to take any questions, but I want to make sure that Jonathan gets a chance to speak, and then maybe uh, the other two can jump back in. So I will come back for the questions later.
Yeah, so I was lucky enough to do a really, really deep dive into a game that was already an obsession of mine before I started like researching it. And I think it still kind of continues to be an obsession of mine today. It's kind of like my guilty pleasure, but the game is Red Dead Redemption 2. And the piece that I wrote for this book is a quote that I think really captures the essence of that game's take on the Civil War. So the piece is called "Still Raging in These Fools' Minds," which is actually a quote said by a character in the game describing other characters in the games who are meant to kind of represent neo-Confederates. And so it's a really sort of sophisticated take on not just Civil War combat, but rather the memory of the Civil War, the aftershocks of the Civil War and post-war society. And so I think what I'll do first is start by giving sort of an overview of the game itself, for those who might not have had a chance to play it firsthand or see clips from it. And then I'll talk about some of my interpretation of the Civil War memory and history in the game. Red Dead 2, or Red Dead Redemption 2, was released by Rockstar Games in 2018. And Rockstar is one of the biggest developers like on the planet. They're the makers are the developers of like beloved classics like Grand Theft Auto 5, games that a lot of people play, right? But games that are not always rooted in history. And so Rockstar knows a lot about how to make games that are engrossing, that really set you in a world. And so for Red Dead Redemption 2, which is part of a broader franchise, they made that world a fictionalized version of the US West and South. And so think of Red Dead Redemption 2 as a kind of like a Wild West themed game set in a fictionalized version of the United States circa 1899. The player, when you play the game, at least the sort of story campaign version of the game, you assume control over a character called Arthur Morgan, who's kind of like a fugitive on the run from the law. He's sort of like a grizzled kind of Clint Eastwood type character. And I don't really want to give away too much of the story because the game is like legendary for having this incredibly immersive plot. And so I really don't want to give that away. But suffice it to say that you can take control of Arthur, and basically the gameplay involves you either in the first person or the third person exploring settings based on the US South and West around the turn of the year 1899, 1900. In our times, Red Dead Redemption 2 is still one of the best-selling games of all time. On its opening weekend in 2018, around the holidays, I think, if I remember correctly, the game earned 725 million on its opening weekend, which, to put that in comparison, that I believe is still the best or the second best-selling launch for a video game of all time, but it beat, when it came out, Red Dead Redemption 2 beat the weekend launch of Avengers Endgame the next year, which was famously at that point, kind of thinking back to the pre-COVID point of pop culture, that was like mind-blowing. So it's a lot of money is the point that I'm making. It was a really, really big deal. The game, even though it's going on 5 years at this point, or maybe a little bit older than that even, is still a major cultural touchstone for a generation. And it has a kind of remarkable staying power that most video games don't. You know, every holiday season there are new games, but Red Dead Redemption 2, I think, has stayed. And I hope that it will continue to have a lot of staying power. And so when I played through the game on its release, I was really trying to procrastinate, right? So I was just trying to have a good time, but I'm a historian. And so I couldn't help but notice all of these like Civil War references or Easter eggs, to put it kind of in gamer lingo, set in this fictionalized post-Civil War world. And so in my chapter for the volume Playing at War, I look at the memory of, again, the Civil War in this gamescape of Red Dead Redemption 2. It's loaded with Civil War references. I mean, I have a spreadsheet of them going, and I'm still adding to them as I continue to play through the game in 2024. But to give you kind of a sample, there are amputee veterans, Union and Confederate veterans that you encounter. They really do live up to sort of those like dark turn stereotypes of Civil War veterans that many of us are familiar with. They're hard drinkers. One of them tries to pick your pocket if you're not careful, so watch out for that guy. There are Civil War guns that you can find in the gamescape or the landscape and use. And obviously it's a Rockstar game, so there's a fair amount of shooting involved and some heists and things like that. You can wear old Civil War uniforms. You at one point can stumble across an abandoned Civil War battlefield, complete with Civil War ghosts if you go at the right time of night. But what I was really, really interested in are not these Easter eggs, because the more that I played the game, the more that I found that Red Dead Redemption 2 really deals with the substance of the Civil War, not just with like the decorations of the Civil War left behind in a post-war world. It really gets at the issues that animated the conflict itself much more fully and more critically than prior Civil War era games or Civil War themed games had. Previous games that I grew up playing in the computer era, but sort of the pre-internet computer era, games like Sid Meier's Civil War, other kind of games in that genre had really focused on the battlefield, and especially from a bird's eye view. So we might think of these as being kind of like operational military history themed games. And they were really, I mean, they were fun, right? But they were light on the Civil War substance. They focused overwhelmingly on tactics and strategy and things like that. That is not the case with Red Dead Redemption 2. It couldn't be further from the truth. Red Dead 2 is really focused, at least in its, the facets of it that deal with the Civil War, are really focused more on memory. So in addition to Civil War guns and uniforms and disturbed veterans, you can find Confederate statues as you explore towns that are set in the US South. You can find a soldier's home, and you can meet someone outside the soldier's homes trying to raise money to care for old veterans. And again, that brings me back to the quote that I titled the chapter after. You can encounter the descendants of formerly enslaved people. And so one of the main characters, trying not to give away too much, but one of the main characters in the game is a guy called Lenny, who's in cahoots with Arthur, the player's character. And Lenny is a fascinating character. He's the son of enslaved people. If you spend a lot of time talking or listening to Lenny, he tells you the hard truths about slavery, at least as many of them as the developers could fit or chose to fit into the game. As you sort of poke around different parts of the gamescape, you can find like an abandoned slave jail that has like rusty chains hanging from the wall. There's a mission where you're tasked with bringing a former slave trader to justice. The mission is tellingly called Iniquities of History. And so there are all of these really loaded, and I can't help but think intentional portrayals of the Civil War's memory and legacy built into the game. And of course, I can't help but mention that one of the things that some players have found as they've played the game is that you can actually stumble across a gathering of the KKK at one point in a certain place in the game. And so you are encouraged through the game's kind of in-game reward system to actually attack them. And so these are not like morally neutral depictions, in other words, of the Civil War's memory. There are conscious choices that are made by Rockstar in its depiction of the past. And so what I ultimately argue, kind of the bottom line takeaway that I hope that readers will take away and other scholars will take away, is that Red Dead 2 really does mark a turning point in the sort of memory and cultural history of the Civil War. It's the first major like lost cause game in a lot of ways. And so I see it as kind of a future of Civil War memory studies. And so I can see that we have a lot of questions. I have a lot more to say, but I'll save it for the Q&A.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much for those presentations. We've got lots to talk about, so many fascinating themes here. First, I just want to see if any of the panelists want to respond to anything their colleagues said, or do you want to jump right into the audience questions?
Let's hear from the audience.
Great. All right. Well, I'm going to start with a couple of questions on the theme of accuracy and decision making. And this was a question that began in response to what Kathleen was talking about the different definitions of accuracy and accuracy at different points, the beginning, the middle, and the end. This attendee is wondering about the way that soldiers' actions are connected to what's happening in politics or in the home front, in the press, or whatever. In history, we know those connections are really important. What about in the game? This person is asking, how do they determine the limits of what an individual player can decide? They're trying to get a complete picture in their mind of concepts of accuracy. Is it like reenacting? And then I'm just going to continue, because the same attendee, I think, had some similar kinds of questions based on Jonathan's example, is how far does this individual decision-making of the game player go? Can you commit sexual or domestic violence? They're asking, can you be a Klansman or a Klanswoman? How far does this individual decision-making go?
I can go first, Jonathan, if you want. Yeah, so I was reading that question, and that is a really great question that I could dive pretty far into. We don't have enough time, so I will just say that the decision-making limitations or freedoms do vary based on the game. So there are some games that are only looking at military strategy, and so those limits, when you look at some of those more just battlefield games, they might have limitations on like you can't move like all your troops to one place. Like you might have a limitation on how much you can move. Some games will at least have the starting points be the same. So like in Gettysburg, when you have kind of the three different attack points, they might keep some of that timing the same and then let you make decisions based off of that. Some games, let you kind of control things on a company level. Some games let you control things on only an army level or a corps level. So there are some of those limitations or freedoms put in place. But you are completely correct that a lot of what soldiers are doing are connected to what's going on in the outside the battlefield. So there is one game that I talked to the developers of, and I talk about it a lot in the chapter, called Forge of Freedom. And I'm trying to pull it up. This is a fascinating game to me because they try to do exactly that. They have besides the military, they have a political layer, economic layer, international diplomacy. So basically, when you go in as a player, there are 42 different options that you can turn on or off to make the game as simple or as complex as you want. So like you can turn all those things on and have to deal with the military strategy, but also the gubernatorial elections or the economy that's happening. So there are some kind of newer games. That one was released in 2006 that do try to kind of add in more of that stuff. I think there was another one that I also had talked to the developer of, and it was more of a kind of like southern wide strategic thing where you could talk about the blockades and like all of those kind of things too. So it depends on what the developer wants the player to get out of it. But in a lot of ways, you have to kind of let the player have a lot more decision making than maybe would be accurate, or else they're not going to want to play the game. So it really does depend on the game. And yes, some games do kind of come down to almost like you're reenacting or simulating the battle.
I'd jump in to add to this question from a couple of the authors that are not on this webinar, but whose work is relevant here. Katie Brackett wrote this really incredible chapter. She's not a gamer herself. Again, that was a very intentional choice. And you know, she's a historian of emotion. And you know, studies you know, women's literature and writers and things like that in the 19th century. And so she really looked at the instruction manuals that come with these games. And especially as you move farther back in time, when just the software and the technology is just not complex enough to model all of these different variables, right? You can't layer in all of these things. You know, those game designers, you know, resort to the written word to sort of set this emotional context. And especially when you get into these considerations of motivation, home front, you know, what the soldier is thinking or the general is thinking when they are on the battlefield. Those are things that those game designers are hoping that the player has to supply themselves as a human being, and they're trying, at least in what limited capacity they have, to suggest the appropriate emotional context as they understand it at the time. Now, as I remarked when I, you know, was you know, reading the proposal in the first draft of this, I never read the instruction manual for anything. After I figured out how to install it, I'm going, but that's just me. I supplied my own mental world, and that, you know, whatever, we can talk about how successful those things are, but that was the way that they were trying to do that. I think also, you know, this kind of this realm of choice and what a game designer tries to model is really fascinating. We had a great chapter that compared the inclusion or silent exclusion more frequently of the Holocaust from World War II games and enslavement from Civil War video games, right? It's just the unspoken reality of both of those conflicts. You know, how are you making, you know, economic decisions about you know, Confederate industry and Nazi German industry without recognizing the impact of slave labor? You know, why inexplicably do you have to station units, you know, in you know, supposedly conquered territories to maintain, you know, a social system, et cetera, right? So all of those things we don't have to, nobody thinks about and nobody models, and that's a really interesting tacit exclusion.
Yeah, and to kind of bring in Nick Sacco's chapter there, he looked at a game called Freedom, which was developed by the same company that produced the Oregon Trail, and so it had some educational aspirations behind it and support behind it. And that game does essentially, it sort of gamifies sort of the fugitive slave experience and running away from enslavement. And his chapter does a really great job of historicizing that game, but then connecting it sort of to this broader question of popular culture and historical memory in general, where when you do for so long it was to exclude, right, or to marginalize or to distort in ways that sort of rendered it neutral, right, or at least gave the appearance of neutrality. But when you do engage it, it also comes with all kinds of issues, right? The very act of gamifying the enslaved experience risks trivializing, and that was one of the main critiques of Freedom, as Nick points out in his essay. So that brings up, you know, when you do engage these things, in the rare instances where it happens, the developers do sort of incorporate it. It raises all kinds of other questions about historical accuracy and what we mean by that. So it's kind of a bit of a catch-22, I think, for a developer. And so it kind of makes sense that many of them more or less avoid it from an entertainment and production standpoint.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in here and say real quick that I think that that has, in the last like 30 years or so, that Civil War games have really become widespread and kind of proliferated. That has been kind of the main approach historically, to just stay away from the hard stuff, right? But and this is one of the reasons why I make the case that Red Dead Redemption is kind of 2 is kind of a turning point. It doesn't. It leans into conversations about the hard stuff in a million different ways in the game. And so I think that part of the reason for that is that these developers are starting to realize that their core audience, right, their core consumers, don't necessarily want to just gloss over the hard stuff. And the data on this is really hard to come by. Rockstar, to give you one example, is notoriously like a black box. Like, I've tried many different ways to contact and interview and speak with Rockstar, and have had very limited success. And so it's hard to put yourselves in the mindset of the developers but from their kind of descriptions of their research process, their writing process, some of the comments that they've made about what they were thinking when they developed the game, they seem to have had an awareness that the moment had come to deal with this history in a more substantive way, rather than just to kind of gloss it over and do like Civil War light in the game. And so I'm optimistic that more game developers will take a cue from Rockstar, especially because it's such a huge heavyweight in the field. But we do see with games like War of Rights, which is a recent game that's an ongoing game as well too, with a lot of live players that continue to play the game online. It's literally called War of Rights. Like, it does not deal with the issues involved in the Civil War consciously. And so I think you've got a kind of a split screen thing going on here. I was going to say something else about that, but I completely blanked out, so it'll come back to me later.
How closely do video games and the changing way they represent Civil War history track changes in the movie industry? Because obviously that's a medium that you can use to study, broader changes and perceptions of what happened during the Civil War, what's important. So is it basically the same trajectory in both media?
I think that would hold from what most of the chapters found. Game developers, and especially the design and the illustration language, are really tapping into popular cinema. So my chapter, I selfishly took Sid Meier's Gettysburg, which was just my absolute favorite when I was growing up, and it really kind of dove into and absolutely wallowed in the movie Gettysburg and the tie-ins that design team very intentionally baked in. Of course, I mean, that was at the height of a late 80s, early 90s, Civil War popular culture that we'll probably not ever see again in terms of sort of broad spectrum social coverage. And yeah, they're explicitly trying to tie that in, almost to a point where it seems like a licensed game at some point. I think the really interesting things that I got out of writing the chapter were, going back to the original Killer Angels novel, understanding how the Ron Maxwell, film production team made some subtle but important shifts to the interpretation from the Shara novel, and then how those got carried over into the game. But especially, with the Western games, I think those movie tie-ins are just so explicit.
Very good. We have a question from a self-identified Gen Z student whose first Civil War game was History Channel Civil War on the Xbox 360.
I'm sorry.
Garbage game.
who noticed a recent review on emerging Civil War that seemed to vaguely reject the social critiques that you make in the book. If you've seen reviews like this, how would you respond?
I hadn't until I pulled it up after I saw the question pop into the chat. I think that exactly as we've been talking about, the reviewer there was sort of thinking, and ECW is a great series. I read a lot of those books. I know a lot of those authors. They are my kind of comfort reads when I just want to chill out and read some Civil War military history and not think about much else. And that's the key, right? They focus on the battlefield in the same way that a lot of these games do. That's the core audience. That's a paying audience. That's an audience that quite honestly attends lots of Civil War events that we do in public, and buys our books. So, but at the same time, I think coming back to Jonathan mentioned War of Rights as an evolving game, and yeah, like it's tough because the developers there have this ambiguous title that you can read in all kinds of whose rights, what rights, all kinds of different ways. But the important point is, and where Dan Farrell really takes the ball and runs with it, is diving into those forum comments, those Reddit comments, where the players themselves are demanding more. And they want an answer, right? They want to know what this game means before I'm going to invest my time in it. What's motivating this game? Which rights and whose rights? Is this going to support what I believe the war was about? So I think that tells me that along with the success of a game like Red Dead, that there's more of a demand now for a game that has a broader meaning rather than just an escapist fantasy of popping back into a battlefield and pushing somebody down Little Round Top.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I would make the case that and many other, scholars and media critics and players have made the case too. So it's not, not my bright idea here, but I think that's the trend that the broader gaming industry, or at least history themed games are drifting towards. And maybe not even drifting, but like running towards. So if you look at other US history themed games like World War II, first person shooter games, for example, like your kind of classic Call of Duty, some of the many Call of Duty titles. I remember playing the very first Call of Duty, which I think came out in 2003, and it was just a very sort of generic kind of like almost modeled on Saving Private Ryan's style game. Like you just played kind of a meaningless shooter game without a whole lot of context. Fast forward to one of the more recent Call of Duties. It came out in 2017, I think. It was just called Call of Duty World War II. It has you as a player liberate a Holocaust concentration camp, or at least find the remnants of a Holocaust concentration camp. And so that's a massive leap in just a few short years from a meaningless game to a game that consciously engages with history in a more critical way. And I think, Patrick, like I agree with what you're saying. I think one of the reasons why these game developers, who above all are interested in making good products, but also making money, they see a demand in their audience and their consumers for more substantive games. And so there's many different examples, but the one, the Call of Duty World War II with the Holocaust concentration camp really struck me. And I think it struck a nerve with a lot of people as well.
Great. Thank you. We have a question from a scholar of medieval Japan who's drawing some comparisons here with video games about medieval Japan. For example, Ghost of Tsushima and Assassin's Creed Shadows. And there are others apparently, which sound like very serious kinds of games that they say have drawn a lot of attention in the popular and academic realms. So is the same kind of thing beginning to happen in Civil War history? I suspect maybe you see your volume as part of a movement in this direction. Is it a movement that's happening elsewhere as well?
Well, I think game studies, there's a longer history of game studies and people have been studying games from a critical and scholarly lens for a while now. But I do think Civil War history and Civil War memory has largely sort of not tapped into that scholarship and not really been a part of that conversation. That was one of the things I think. I mean, honestly, once we started digging into it, I mean, I found it somewhat surprising that in all of the volumes on Civil War memory and engagement with popular culture, I mean, we've looked at fiction, we've looked at film, we've looked at art, we've looked at every aspect of popular culture. How have we not looked at video games really at all in a sustained way? And so that there's some of that in snippets in sort of the larger game studies world, but not really in a sustained way, in a way that's coming at it from the scholarship on Civil War memory. So yeah, I mean that was one of the things that we found exciting about pulling this volume together. But I do think in a lot of ways, despite it being a relatively long book with a lot of authors and essays, right, it's still in some ways just scratching the surface in terms of getting into the complexities of these games and what they mean and their historical moments. So yeah.
I'd almost kind of flip the question around a little bit, or maybe reconfigure it. I don't know if the Civil War is that popular. And I say this again as somebody who grew up amidst the height of the glory, Ken Burns, Gettysburg, the Holy Trinity of the early 90s. And the massive, reenactments, and I grew up in that subculture as well, so I'm happy to address that question a little bit if we want to get into that later. But it really does strike me, and I remember hearing these complaints. Saving Private Ryan, which we've already mentioned as inspiring the Call of Duty series, completely changed the cultural landscape. And young men who were interested in military history focused on World War II after that, almost exclusively, and Civil War participation, Civil War roundtable membership, Civil War reenactment numbers out on the field, just all absolutely tanked. And Civil War video games started trying to chase that Call of Duty model after that, right? So the 90s was the era of the tactical simulation. And then as soon as you kind of turn the page into the 2000s, everybody's trying to do, and this is where that History Channel game comes in, that everybody's trying to do a Civil War Call of Duty. And it's tough because first-person shooters really need automatic weapons to be good. And the technology just isn't there, and you have to kind of struggle to make some sense of it. I think War of Rights has probably gotten about as close as anybody's ever going to do to actually modeling real battlefield combat with rifled muskets and bayonets. I think that's about as good as it gets. But what that tells me is the Civil War market is chasing broader cultural trends, not leading them, and I think that's indicative of the broader sort of loss of place of that conflict in the kind of the top spot in American popular memory.
Yeah, I think that's reflected in the response to that I've gotten a lot, even from Civil War historians at conferences. Like, there are enough games to make a book about Civil War video games. I mean, that I've heard that multiple times from people who do history, much less from people who are for history is more of a passing interest. So I definitely think that's probably far more true now than maybe it was when I think most of our authors who contributed to the book, we were kind of coming of age. We came of age at the height of Civil War popularity. So
we have a question coming more from a kind of museum perspective. And this viewer mentions that there's been a lot of discussion recently about the positive role that play, broadly construed, has for communities. So do you believe games like these can be leveraged in public educational programming, and how?
I do. Yeah, I feel like a bobblehead right now. I mean, so I absolutely do. And I think we are kind of, at least academic historians kind of teaching at the college level, maybe I should say, when I'm talking about we, that's kind of who I'm talking about, are sort of behind the curve on this. Like lots and lots of different educational professionals from museum studies, but also K-12 teachers, even the U.S. Army and some of its training programs for soldiers have embraced and have long embraced video games as a kind of a teaching tool. And so there's also a robust body of scholarship that talks about the effectiveness of using games as a teaching tool. And so, yeah, there's a lot of room to kind of grow here. I think one of the most fascinating parts of games as teaching tools for me is this ability for people that are consuming the game to really like make, so to kind of throw back to one of the questions that was asked a few moments ago, to make to sort of play around with decision making, right? And so when a lot of people through traditional mediums like movies or books, right, when they engage with the narrative of history, it's like given to them. So there's a defined beginning point, middle point, and an end point, and you can't deviate from that. But games are so exciting for a lot of for a lot of people. For me when I was a kid, but also a lot of people at various sort of stages in their development, because they offer chances to break out and do different decisions. And so I think there's a lot of if we lean into that as a field, I think we can do a lot more with these as teaching tools than we have done so far. Like I said, I do think that we are behind the curve. I also want to throw in there to kind of illustrate how far behind the curve we actually are. This volume is the first, that's kind of a depressing thought, but this volume is the first, major like study of Civil War themed video games, but gaming is already the biggest entertainment industry on the planet. Right. This year in 2024, I just looked this up a minute ago. Video games globally are projected to be worth $455 billion. Hollywood is only worth $80 billion, right? And so the world is like here, and historians of the Civil War are like here, and we need to catch up really, really fast to engage with this medium, because it is not just a future of Civil War studies, Civil War memory studies. It's like the now, and we're kind of in the past in a lot of ways. But that's sort of my soapbox. This is a great question.
Yeah, and I think one of the benefits of this volume, however behind the times I think it definitely is. I was shocked that there was not a more robust historiography on video games and gaming culture. But I think one of the values is maybe explaining the reticence on the part of educators, because some of the early attempts to use games as instructional tools fall on their face in kind of epic fashion, right? And that's largely a product of technological limitations. There's in terms of computing technology and processing technology, there's just not that much they can do in some of these early eras, right? And so you can't build complexity into your world, right, if you don't have the capacity to do that. And so that's part of it. But then the other part was a lot of these games in sort of these early pedagogical uses tended to be kind of standalone. They didn't often come with curricular support and sort of a curriculum surrounding them. And so that raised all kinds of issues with students, with parents, with teachers, and because there was no consistency behind the contextualization of the game. And so I think all of that is informing, I hesitate to call it outright fear, but I do think there's sort of a lingering legacy of that early era that's still maybe subconsciously sort of in sort of education realms. But I do think you're right. There's a lot of, I think at K through 12 levels and in museum studies, there's a lot of people sort of experimenting with the utility of this in ways that, I don't know, maybe that fear is more palpable among people in higher ed. We're an anxious lot, I think. So
Yeah, I wanted to throw in a couple of things too on this one. Yes, play and doing things are very important in both education and museum experiences. It's broadly shown that people are going to remember more what they do at a site than everything that they're going to hear content-wise. Um, sorry. So I think that there is definitely an opportunity to use something like video games to teach certain things, as long as the right context is there or the right messaging is there. I mean, one of you guys was talking about like the being a child of the 90s and growing up in that heyday. I mean, we all remember Oregon Trail. we all remember like, okay, everyone died from dysentery because right? Because that is what we learned in that video game. So there is certainly opportunities there. And there's also opportunities to take the idea of play from like a video game into other experiences. So like when I was giving tours at the Fredericksburg battlefield, I actually would bring toy guns with me and have parts of my group interact and kind of make decisions, or they were kind of guided to making decisions, but they were kind of having to put themselves into those situations and figure out what is going on. And people really responded to that. And I wanted to kind of tie this into another question that was further down in the chat about how we use video games to reach students or the public. And a lot of us in this book did say that there are certain problematic things about how media or how the video games show this very complex history, but it gets people in the door. You know, I worked at Chancellorsville and Fredericksburg, so of course we had the gods and generals, you know, looming over us in terms of problematic memory, but it got people in the door. It got people interested in learning more, and then they could interact with us as historians and learn more about maybe a more realistic thing that happened. Like no, Jackson was not killed by a sharpshooter, but it got them in the door. And so these video games, even if they are not accurate, it gets people into the conversation, and that's something that's important.
So the great popularity of video games resonates with a comment someone just made, which is that this provides a wonderful opportunity for Civil War historians to get their work out there to new audiences, to video game players. So that's very encouraging if we can figure out how to do that. And then there's also a question, though, about presumably that's already kind of happening. The video game developers are using our scholarship, you know, as a community of Civil War historians. Are they crediting that scholarship at all? How does that work?
I think that the best example that I can think of is not actually from Civil War historians, but from historians of like the ancient world, especially Greece and Rome. One of the other big historical themed game franchises, the Assassin's Creed franchise, which is set all over the place in every era that you can think of. They have, in recent iterations of the game, made it a point to like reach out and hire like archaeologists, historians, classicists, right, to really help them recreate accurate but also sort of authentic feeling versions of the world that these fictionalized games are set in. And so some of these games even feature these like modes that you can sort of play the game in. I think they're called discovery tour mode, something along those lines, where basically you can open up the game, you can walk around like ancient Rome as if it were a museum, and you're asking people like, what do you do all day? That sort of thing. And in those iterations of the game, they do credit the scholars that have worked on the game. Some of the other developers have been less like, they've been a lot more murky about what their influences are. And so I'll kind of throw back to Rockstar here, which you know, again, famously is like not willing to talk very openly about its methodology, but from best guess or from kind of educated guesswork, not just by me, but other media kind of study scholars who have specialized in Rockstar games, they take their influences both from academic history, but also pop culture. So in Red Dead Redemption 2, you can see really sophisticated portrayals of Civil War memory that must have been rooted in like David Blight and that sort of scholarship, because there's no other way that they could have gotten that material. But you can also see like John Ford Westerns and how they influenced the game as well. And so I would love to see more. You know, if I had like an open phone line with game developers, I would say credit your sources more. Tell us where you're getting your material from.
I think, and yeah, I think ultimately the proof is in the code, right? And the sort of experiences. I love Jonathan's line earlier. Is Red Dead is a dark turn world. You know, and so that's like, yeah, like we know all of the books that they had to have read to have characterized, to have built this world and populate it with these people. I think just from an editorial perspective on the volume, this is not answering the question, but it reminded me of it. So sorry. You know, I was struck as we would get draft chapters in at the early stages, and you know, it's really easy for us as historians to say, well, they didn't do this right, you know, they didn't model this this thing, this element, this variable, this condition, you know, be it international diplomacy or enslavement or whatever it is. Native American participation, some games are modeling that, super cool. You know, and we had to kind of stop and say, like, okay, but give the game developers some grace here. One, recognize technological limitations and how many things they can stack on top before the whole house collapses. But also, and I think this was really especially true for some of the earlier games, can we realistically expect a game developer to be incorporating a conversation about some sort of social factor into their work, when academic historians were reluctant to do that, right? And you know, we were looking at some games and, you know, like, oh, why didn't they model you know, this, that, or the other? Is like, well, when's the first book that really kind of popularized this and made everybody in our academic world perk their ears up and go, oh wow, I've really got to deal with that now? And so, okay, maybe that book had just come out, or maybe it was 5 years old. Are you really expecting a game designer to go back and be reading dissertations and following conference proceedings and sort of anticipate stuff that again, that our colleagues are going to take a decade worth of lag time to catch up to and do that? And so it's you know, kind of giving these games the same amount of grace in some ways that we would grant somebody when we're writing a historiographical article.
I'm gonna jump in and say that in a lot of entertainment media, you're not gonna have citations like you do in a historical source. But in terms of the people I talked to, the Tiller games, they actually do have um what did they call them? A manual of design notes. So each game that they do, they actually have a like manual that comes along with it if you want to read it. And it does cite a lot of the research and a lot of the sources that they use. Now that is not typical necessarily. They are really like above board in terms of all the research that they do. But you know, to Patrick's other point about expecting developers to be up and up on all this historic research, we know with academic scholarship and then public history, it takes time for some of the kind of new research and sources and ideas to kind of feed down into the public. Um, and I had a very interesting interview with a game designer that I don't think I included fully in the chapter. He had made a game called Ironclads, and it was a very like off at like if the Civil War had like robots, kind of very offbeat thing.
I was
And
sad
at
when
the
that
end
got
of
cut.
it, yeah, that was what to get cut. But it was fascinating because when the game ended in this very rosy picture of like reconciliation and like Western expansion and like just weird stuff. And he fully admitted to me, he was like, if I had known half the stuff I know now about this history, I would not have finished my game like that, because it was very, very like glossing over a lot of like Reconstruction and race and all of this stuff. It was a very happy-go-lucky, like Robert E. Lee, like, you know, shakes hands and we're all good. It was just very eye-opening to me as a historian to have someone who's not a historian say, I didn't know these things, and now I kind of regret putting that storyline in my game because it really doesn't sit well with me anymore. So you have to, yeah, you have to understand that these are not historians a lot of times that are making these games. It's awesome if they bring a historian on as a consultant, but they're not usually historians themselves.
So maybe one of the developments we can hope for in the future is more collaboration between game developers and historians. That would be awesome to see. And hopefully the fact that now there's a book out on Civil War video games will hasten that future. I'm afraid we're out of time now. I want to end by reading one of the comments in the chat, or reading part of one of the comments in the chat. One viewer says, "This has been one of the most interesting conversations I've heard all year. Thank you all very much." And they're planning to share the recording with their students. So I want to echo that and say it's also been one of the most interesting conversations I've heard. It's been a real pleasure to be with you all tonight, and really congratulate you on the production of a fine volume of essays. And hopefully, as you're aspiring to, this will be the start of a new subfield of Civil War era history, taking into account the importance of video games. So thanks to everyone in the audience for being with us tonight, spending their evening with us and asking such great questions. Thanks to the donors to the Virginia Center for Civil War Studies who made it possible. And most of all, thank you to our wonderful panelists for great presentations and then a wonderful conversation as well. Thank you all very much. Hope to see you at some future events, and have a good evening.